So the reason why I chose the marketing path was a conversation that I had while I was out in China with one of the colleagues out there. And I mean, we put hours and hours and hours into putting together a proposal for a competition. And we kind of started talking about what happens to it once it leaves the door. Does it ever get published? Does it hit the right media channels? And we realized for our office that it went nowhere other than in the client's hands. And that really was kind of bothersome to me as to, you know, we put all this hard work and effort into something that might be somewhat innovative, I would hope, but maybe it wasn't, I don't know. So we started having this dialogue about how our office specifically worked, and the office I worked at was a French firm, and they did all their marketing in Paris. And they didn't even really start to talk about what the Beijing office was doing, what the Shanghai office was doing. So we started questioning kind of the thought process as to what we did and how we kind of deliver ourselves in the world as architects. Matt wants to.
Informed my entire childhood and probably yours. And all of these products succeeded because someone figured out how to touch people in a way that they weren't expecting, in a way they didn't necessarily want, with an ad over and over and over again until they bought it. And the thing that's happened is they canceled the TV industrial complex. That just over the last few years, what anybody who markets anything has discovered is it's not working the way that it used to. The product in the blue box in the center is my poster child, right? I go to the deli, I'm sick, I need to buy some medicine. The brand manager for that blue product spent $100 million trying to interrupt me in 1 year. $100 million interrupting me with TV commercials and magazine ads and spam and coupons and shelving allowances and spiffs. Also, I could ignore every single message. And I ignored every message because I don't have a pain reliever problem. I buy the stuff in the yellow box, I always have. And I'm not going to invest a minute of my time to solve her problem because I don't care.
Basically what he was talking about is that even though we might go through the process of marketing ourselves or our buildings or our services of some sort, do the clients that we're working for, do they really care that we're even marketing anything? In the history, on my PDF, they kind of went through this history of marketing and how marketing specifically worked in architecture, you know, and this was actually news to me. I didn't know that architects in the early 1900s up to the 1950s and 60s couldn't go out and actually market themselves. Work actually had to come to them through via different routes. Clients would have to specifically come, and they couldn't actually outbid or change the price quotes on the things that they were offering, the services that they were offering. So it was just really interesting to see kind of the history of kind of the thought process in why architects aren't maybe the best marketers in general. The way that our studio culture is set up has allowed marketing to be trended towards marketing to other architects, kind of showing what we do to other architects, not necessarily talking about how we can help a client, how we can deliver something that becomes a service for a specific client. You want to play the other clip?
Lead us. Michelle Kaufman has pioneered new ways of thinking about environmental architecture. She doesn't do it by quietly building one house at a time. She does it by telling a story to people who want to hear it, by connecting a tribe of people who are desperate to be connected to each other, by leading a movement and making change, and around and around and around.
So, I think where we have kind of failed in recent times is being able to kind of tell the story of what we do and kind of telling a story to our clients, being able to make them live the idea of what their project is, what they're coming to us for.
So what I tried to focus on originally was I started looking at, a lot of people have been talking about the future, the technology, the different parts of building, stuff like that. And so I started to look at different things, and I realized, we've been talking about the technology and the future of all these different parts and pieces. What about the entire system as a whole? So you talk about, the future of a building. What's the building going to look like in the future? Well, what if you designed a building for the future that, there was not, the future, it just keeps adapting, keeps changing to what the future would be, and, the external and internal conditions that it needs to respond to. Living buildings just basically are self-sufficient. They're not relying on the power grid or anything else. They usually are net zero, or basically they'll either give power back to the grid or be completely equal. And then regenerative buildings are buildings basically you build in areas where a site has been destroyed, like a brownfield or something, where you're regenerating that ecosystem and the building lives within that system well, and it gives power back to the grid or water or something of that nature.
I'm going to follow that with Matt, because you had a YouTube that matched up with Beasley used. So you've got to be sort of track on a similar sort of subject, right? Go ahead.
Kind of. It's sort of an example that led from the article that I presented. This article is a publication that was done through a study by Building Futures Incorporated through RIBA, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects. And what this was a sort of comprehensive study of interviewing architects, students, clients, and consultants, trying to see what their vision of how the profession of architecture is going to unfold professionally by 2025, and sort of set up a set of predictors that'll allow us to kind of gauge where the practice and business models are going to be sort of evolving to. So what they did is they went around and surveyed a bunch of firms and a bunch of people, and asked them questions on what is their ideal vision for the next 10 years, what is their realized vision for the next 10 years, and sort of what are the things that are going to get in the way, and how are things changing now, and how is that going to sort of play itself out over the next 15, 20 years. What they sort of concluded through many of the architecture firms is that a lot of them saw that the medium-sized firms, the 20 to 100, is going to start to dissolve itself and break apart over the next 15 years. They don't see this as a sustainable business model in the way of traditional architecture. A lot of the design work has been sort of handed over to engineers over the past years, and they sort of see that continuing and say that we shouldn't reject that, but it's something that we can accept and change our models in a certain way. Some of the consultants that they interviewed sort of spoke to the same notion and said that architects need to not try to make up lost ground, but they should realize that they'd be better suited in a managerial position at an engineering firm or something like that, and sort of change the business model completely at that scale. And other people sort of fell in line with that and sort of said that we need to, maybe the stifling becomes from the connotation of calling yourself an architect, and maybe we need to become more multidisciplinary and start to branch out in other fields, and a lot of firms are starting to do that. Whereas the areas where they kind of saw weren't going to really change too much were sort of the local, small firm scale markets that are dealing with sort of direct regional priority in their area. It's a more personal sense. They also felt that a lot of the sort of budget line item projects that are, sort of like shopping centers and things like that aren't concerned about making a great grand statement to architecture, but are there trying to create a building to occupy that's efficient, are still going to be around. And then so when they started to talk to students, they kind of got this idea of the same thing, where the student didn't really want to focus on architecture as it is now, but really wanted to tap into this multidisciplinary approach. Some of them had talked about where they thought maybe a business model could stay half traditional and half sort of more contemporary, where you spend half of your week doing regular projects within the firm, and then spend half of your week doing more personal things that can start to brand yourself and create your own identity in terms of non-architecture and installations and art and things like that, and technology. So it was a really interesting article in terms of that, where it kind of saw this maybe 50% of the market completely changing and retrofitting itself to not just architecture, but really branching out to a more broad approach, which would sort of fill in the gaps as things slow down and other things pick up. And it's just really freaking cool.
Ancient Greek, which means life coming out of material. It's a concept that perhaps each of us have had an experience of when we were children, debating whether rocks are alive or not. In this project, hylozoism is quite specific. That is, we are working with subtle materials and electricity and chemistry, weaving together interactions that at first create a responsive architecture that simulates life. But increasingly, these interactions are starting to act like life, like some of the ingredients. This meshwork then is clothed with arrays of mechanisms which work in subtle ways in order to allow the entire environment to start to breathe and shift and move in relationship to us. It's then further clothed in arrays of microprocessors that invest this environment with intelligence, with an insect-like intelligence, and it enables the environment to work like a coral reef or a great swarm. Very primitive, sometimes stuttering, sometimes hiccuping, sometimes convulsive kinds of primitive intelligence. And then, in the latest development of this work, beyond the interactive systems and the kinesis that we've invested this work with, and the simple swarm-like crowd intelligence, now we're investing the work with a wet chemistry system, which works a bit like the lymphatic system of your own body, or the circulation system, which gathers in toxins and converts them into harmless substances like limestones and carbonates. These layers, then, the meshwork, the structure, the kinetic environment, the muscles, the neurons, and the intelligence, the memory, and then the active circulation system is working in a comprehensive way in order to create a responsive architectural system.
So I felt like that was a pretty interesting example, and it sort of is an example of what you were talking about, in that this isn't really architecture, but it's using the principles of architecture to create technology that will sort of shape the future in a really dynamic way.
Well, I was focusing on the future in terms of how we think about things, so design thinking in general. This article that I sent out, what is the AIGA, American Institute of Graphic Artists Thinking About the Future of Design, covers some interesting things, like someone was talking about how we are, design education, we know how to master techniques, we know how to produce certain bodies of work, yet we're still not as, we're not as respected or influential as maybe one originally thought. That comes from moving toward a role less defined by making two-dimensional objects than by conceiving of strategies that might include a multitude of media and dimensions. And to me, that is what we need to focus on, is strategies. I think that Studio definitely ingrains the design aspect and producing, but the strategies that we need to start thinking towards are things that architects are good at doing, because we have these skills to problem solve in general. So this is the kind of thing that we need to focus on instead of the pretty picture. In school, that we're to Tim Brown, the video I sent out, and he had a very interesting intro to what he wanted to talk about, saying that he was in charge of designing a fax machine, just like the outside of it, how it looked. And he said, and only 8 months later or something, the technology was completely obsolete. So what he brought from that was that design isn't all that important. You have to take a different view of design, focus less on the object and more on design thinking. And that, to me, I mean, we all think about the object, and I think that that is kind of being phased out because we don't need to build as much anymore. There are a lot of buildings, so maybe design thinking is a way of retrofitting those buildings to be something like what Chris was talking about, just adaptable, something that is going to be around for a while.
But I do think that perhaps design is getting big again. And that's happening through the application of design thinking to new kinds of problems. To global warming, to education, healthcare, security, clean water, whatever. And as we see this reemergence of design thinking, and we see it beginning to tackle new kinds of problems, there are some basic ideas that I think we can observe that are useful. And I'd like to talk about some of those just for the next few minutes. The first of those is that design is human-centered. It may integrate technology and economics, but it starts with what humans need, or might need. What makes life easier or enjoyable? What makes technology useful and usable? But that's more than simply good ergonomics, putting the buttons in the right place. It's often about understanding culture and context before we even know where to start to have ideas. Instead of starting with technology, the team started with people and culture. So if human need is the place to start, then design thinking rapidly moves on to learning by making. Instead of thinking about what to build, building in order to think. And prototypes speed up the process of innovation, because it's only when we put our ideas out into the world that we really start to understand their strengths and weaknesses. And the faster we do that, the faster our ideas evolve.
So we need to think divergently instead of, I don't even know if that's a word. We need to diverge instead of converge. So we're thinking of new ideas and alternatives instead of just making